Sometimes the loneliest people are those who've lost everything they thought they needed to be happy. Sometimes hope arrives on a dusty train platform, wearing the wrong face and carrying secrets that could change everything. Benjamin Dalworth, a 52-year-old widower, waits at the train station for his mail-order bride. He's been alone on his mountain homestead for 3 years, and he needs help. But the woman who steps off that train isn't the young bride he ordered. She's Evelyn Chambers, 47 years old, educated, and she has no intention of marrying anyone. She's running from her own past and has taken her niece's place to avoid scandal. What starts as two stubborn people who don't want each other slowly becomes something neither expected. But when Evelyn's dangerous past catches up to her, will their growing connection survive? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the peaks of the Rocky Mountains like a widow's veil, and Benjamin Dalworth understood that metaphor better than most men should. He stood on the weathered porch of his log cabin, watching the sun paint the valley below in shades of gold and amber. 3 years had passed since Martha died, and still he caught himself setting 2 coffee cups on the kitchen table each morning before remembering. The faded wedding photograph tucked inside his vest pocket felt heavier than its paper weight suggested. He'd carried it everywhere since the funeral, a talisman against the crushing silence that filled every corner of his homestead. Martha's smile looked back at him from behind cracked glass, forever frozen at 28, forever young, forever gone. Benjamin's hands, scarred from years of splitting wood and mending fences, trembled slightly as he folded the letter from the matrimonial agency. Miss Catherine Whitfield, 23 years old, skilled in cooking and household management, eager to begin a new life in the territories. The photograph she'd sent showed a sweet-faced girl with gentle eyes and an uncertain smile. Not Martha, of course. No one could ever be Martha. But perhaps someone who could help him remember what it felt like to be alive instead of merely surviving. The hand-carved rocking chair beside him creaked in the mountain breeze, its smooth pine surfaces worn to silk by Martha's presence during the evenings they'd spent planning their future. He'd made it for her their first winter together, when the snows had trapped them in the cabin for months, and he'd needed something to do with his restless hands. Now it sat empty, a monument to conversations that would never resume, and grandchildren who would never climb onto his lap to hear stories. His nearest neighbor, old Pete Morrison, lived 12 miles down the mountain, and the town of Cedar Falls stretched another 8 miles beyond that. During the harsh mountain winters, Benjamin might go weeks without seeing another human soul. The isolation had been a comfort at first, a place to nurse his grief, away from well-meaning friends who insisted he needed to move on. But 3 years of talking only to his horses, and the wind had left him hollow, echoing with unspoken words and unlived days. The homestead sprawled across 40 acres of prime mountain meadow, with a creek running clear and cold through the center of the property. Benjamin had built everything with his own hands. The 2-story log cabin with its stone chimney, the sturdy barn that housed his 4 horses and handful of cattle, the smokehouse where he cured meat for the long winters. Martha had planted the vegetable garden that now grew wild with neglect, and her rose bushes climbed the porch railings in defiant blooms that he couldn't bring himself to prune. His daily routine had calcified into ritual over the years. Rise before dawn, feed the animals, check the fences, repair whatever the mountain weather had damaged overnight. Eat simple meals alone, at the kitchen table Martha had loved, reading and rereading the same handful of books by lamplight. Sleep came fitfully, when it came at all, in the bed that felt vast and cold without her warmth beside him. The decision to send for a mail-order bride hadn't come easily. Benjamin had wrestled with it through the long nights of his 3rd winter alone, arguing with Martha's memory and his own stubborn pride. But the practical realities couldn't be ignored forever. He needed help with the household tasks that had always been hers. He needed someone to talk to besides the horses. Most of all, he needed to stop feeling like a ghost haunting his own life. Meanwhile, 1,500 miles east in Boston, Evelyn Chambers faced her own desperate circumstances with the same grim determination that had carried her through 47 years of life as a woman alone in a world that preferred women to be ornamental rather than useful. The letter from her creditors lay spread across the mahogany desk in her late father's study, each document a nail in the coffin of her independence. Dr. Edmund Chambers had been one of Boston's most respected physicians, and Evelyn had inherited not only his intelligence and his steady hands, but also his crushing debt to the medical college that had trained him. When consumption claimed him the previous winter, it had left Evelyn with nothing but an education that society deemed inappropriate for a lady and bills that exceeded her modest inheritance by thousands of dollars. She'd managed to keep the house by taking in sewing and giving private lessons to the children of wealthy families, but it wasn't enough. Never enough. The banks had no patience for a spinster's struggles, and Boston society whispered behind gloved hands about the peculiar Miss Chambers who read medical texts and spoke of things no proper lady should know. The matrimonial agency advertisement had arrived like divine intervention, tucked between bills in her morning mail. Western gentleman seeks educated companion for mountain life. Must be hardy, intelligent, and prepared for frontier challenges. The pay offered for traveling west as a mail-order bride would clear her debts and leave enough for a fresh start somewhere else. But Evelyn's niece, the sweet and simple-minded Catherine Whitfield, had responded to the advertisement first. Catherine, barely 23 and romantic to her core, had fallen in love with the idea of marrying a mysterious mountain man and living out her dreams of frontier adventure. She'd exchanged letters with Benjamin Dalworth for months, weaving fantasies around his careful, measured words, and the photograph he'd sent showing a serious man with kind eyes and capable hands. Until 3 days ago, when Catherine had eloped with the baker's son instead, leaving behind nothing but a tearful note and Evelyn's ruined plans for financial salvation. Evelyn stared at her reflection in the hallway mirror and saw her father's stubborn chin and her mother's intelligent eyes staring back at her. 47 years old, educated far beyond what society considered proper for a woman. With graying brown hair she wore in a practical bun and clothes chosen for durability rather than fashion. She was nobody's idea of a mail-order bride, but she was Catherine's aunt, and that would have to be enough. The journey west had taken 6 days on 3 different trains, through landscapes that gradually shifted from the familiar green hills of New England to the vast, empty spaces of the territories. Evelyn had used the time to study Catherine's letters and Benjamin's responses, memorizing details about his life and his expectations. She told herself she would explain the substitution when she arrived, but as the miles rolled past and her desperation grew sharper, she'd begun to consider more drastic measures. The train wheezed to a stop at Cedar Falls just as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the mountain peaks. Evelyn gathered her 2 carpet bags and the leather satchel that contained her father's medical instruments, the only valuable things she'd been unable to sell, and stepped onto the platform with the firm resolve of a woman who had run out of choices. Benjamin stood, waiting beside a weathered wagon hitched to 2 sturdy horses, his broad shoulders and serious expression matching the photograph Catherine had shown her. He was taller than she'd expected, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into mountain sun and mountain snow. His clothes were clean but simple wool trousers, cotton shirt, leather vest, and his boots were practical rather than fashionable. Their eyes met across the platform, and Evelyn saw the exact moment when confusion replaced anticipation in his expression. She was not the young, biddable girl he'd expected. She was not sweet-faced or uncertain or eager to please. She was a woman fully grown, with opinions and education, and a backbone stiffened by years of fighting the world alone. "Mr. Dalworth?" Her voice carried the crisp consonants of her Boston upbringing, so different from the soft mountain drawl she'd expected to hear. "Miss Whitfield?" His voice was deeper than she'd imagined, roughened by years of disuse and tinged with growing uncertainty. "I'm afraid there's been a change of plans." Evelyn lifted her chin and met his gaze directly, the way her father had taught her to face difficult patients and their families. "Catherine couldn't come. I'm her aunt, Evelyn Chambers, and I've taken her place." Benjamin's jaw tightened, and she watched him struggle between politeness and the practical realities of his situation. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, filled with unspoken questions and the weight of expectations that would never be met. "I see." He reached for her bags with automatic courtesy, though his movements were stiff with disappointment. "I suppose we'd better discuss this at the house." The ride up the mountain pass took 2 hours along roads that would have terrified a less determined woman. Evelyn gripped the wagon seat and tried not to look at the sheer drops that yawned beside the narrow track, focusing instead on the magnificent wilderness that surrounded them. She'd lived her entire life within the confines of a city where nature existed in carefully manicured parks and tamed gardens. This vast, untamed landscape felt like stepping into another world entirely. Benjamin drove in silence, his hands steady on the reins and his attention focused on navigating the treacherous path. Occasionally, he would point out a landmark, the eagle's nest on the clifftop, the meadow where he grazed his cattle in summer, the creek that provided his water supply. But he offered no conversation and asked no questions about her circumstances or her intentions. When they finally reached the homestead, Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. The log cabin nestled into the mountainside, as if it had grown there naturally, its windows glowing warm yellow in the gathering dusk. The barn and outbuildings spoke of careful craftsmanship and years of patient maintenance. Everything was orderly, practical, and beautiful in the way that functional things could be when built by skilled hands and maintained with pride. "It's lovely," she said, and meant it. Benjamin's expression softened slightly at the genuine admiration in her voice. "Martha always said it was the prettiest spot on earth." "Your wife?" "Late wife. 3 years now." Evelyn felt something shift in her understanding of this silent, serious man. He wasn't looking for a bride to fill an empty space in his bed. He was looking for someone to help him remember how to live in a house that had become a mausoleum to his grief. He carried her bags to the porch and hesitated, his hand on the door latch. "Miss Chambers, I should tell you that I sent for Catherine Whitfield specifically. I need someone to help with the household tasks, and I can cook and clean." Evelyn interrupted. "I can mend clothes and tend gardens. I can keep accounts and read to you in the evenings if you'd like. I may not be what you ordered, Mr. Dalworth, but I'm what's available." Benjamin studied her face in the lamplight, spilling from the windows, seeing determination where he'd expected submission, and intelligence where he'd hoped for simplicity. This wasn't the pliant young woman who would be grateful for his protection and content with the isolated mountain life. This was a woman with her own thoughts and opinions. Someone who would challenge him and disrupt the careful routine he'd built around his solitude. But as he looked at her standing there on his porch, carpet bags at her feet and her chin raised in quiet defiance, Benjamin realized that perhaps disruption was exactly what he needed. "Well then," he said, opening the door to let the warm light spill out around them, "I suppose you'd better come in." The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by young Tommy Fletcher, who rode the mail route between Cedar Falls and the scattered homesteads in the high country. Evelyn had been at Benjamin's place for 6 days, 6 careful days of learning the rhythms of mountain life and pretending that her arrangement was temporary. She'd established herself in the small room off the kitchen that Benjamin had prepared for his expected bride, keeping her belongings neatly arranged and her presence as unobtrusive as possible. They spoke politely during meals, worked efficiently together on household tasks, and maintained the careful distance of strangers, sharing space out of necessity rather than choice. But the torn letter from Boston changed everything. Evelyn recognized her landlord's handwriting immediately, and her hands trembled as she broke the seal. The contents were worse than she'd feared. Her creditors had discovered her absence and were demanding immediate payment of all outstanding debts. The house had been seized and would be auctioned within the month. More damning still, they'd learned about Catherine's elopement and were threatening to pursue charges of fraud against anyone who had impersonated the intended bride. "Bad news from home?" Benjamin asked, setting down his coffee cup as he watched the color drain from her face. Evelyn folded the letter carefully, her mind racing through possibilities that all led to the same dead end. "It appears my situation in Boston has become more complicated than I'd hoped." "How complicated? How complicated?" She met his eyes across the kitchen table, seeing genuine concern there, alongside the wariness that had colored all their interactions. The kind that makes leaving immediately seem like the wisest course of action. Benjamin was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands and studying her face. "And where exactly would you go?" It was the question she'd been avoiding all morning. "I haven't quite worked that out yet." Before Benjamin could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the window. 3 riders were coming up the mountain trail, and Evelyn recognized the purposeful way they sat their saddles as the bearing of men on official business. "Sheriff Morrison and 2 of his deputies," Benjamin said, his voice carefully neutral. "Wonder what brings them all the way up here?" Evelyn's stomach clenched as she watched the men dismount at the hitching post. She had a terrible suspicion she knew exactly what had brought them. Sheriff Morrison was a man in his 50s with tired eyes and the patience that came from dealing with mountain folk who valued their privacy. He touched his hat politely when Benjamin opened the door, but his gaze moved immediately to Evelyn, standing behind him. In the kitchen. "Morning, Ben. Miss." He nodded to each of them in turn. "I'm afraid I need to ask some questions about your current living arrangements." "What kind of questions?" Benjamin's tone had taken on the careful edge of a man who dealt with law enforcement from both sides of the badge. The kind that come from telegrams sent by officials in Boston who seemed to think there might be some irregularities in a recent matrimonial arrangement. Sheriff Morrison's voice was apologetic but firm. "Mind if we come in and discuss this properly?" Benjamin stepped aside to let the 3 men enter, and Evelyn felt the walls of the small cabin closing in around her. She'd known this moment would come eventually, but she'd hoped for more time to figure out her next move. "Sheriff Morrison, these are serious accusations," Benjamin said once the men had settled around the kitchen table. "Perhaps you could explain exactly what kind of irregularities we're discussing." "Well, according to the telegram I received yesterday, a Miss Catherine Whitfield was supposed to arrive in Cedar Falls as your intended bride. But the folks in Boston seem to think someone else might have taken her place, and they're asking questions about fraud and impersonation." Evelyn lifted her chin and looked the sheriff directly in the eye. "I'm Catherine's aunt, Evelyn Chambers. When she was unable to fulfill her commitment to Mr. Dalworth, I came in her place to explain the situation and settle any obligations." "And where is Miss Catherine now?" "She married someone else," Evelyn said simply. "A local boy in Boston. They eloped 3 days before she was supposed to travel west." Sheriff Morrison made notes in a small leather book, his expression thoughtful. "And you felt it was your responsibility to come all this way, just to deliver that news?" Evelyn felt Benjamin's eyes on her, waiting to see how she would answer. "I felt it was important that Mr. Dalworth understand what had happened. He'd made arrangements and deserved better than simply being left waiting at the train station." "That's mighty considerate of you, Miss Chambers. But the folks in Boston seem to think there might be more to it than that. Something about debts and fraud charges." The words hung in the air like smoke, and Evelyn felt her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. She could deny the charges, but that would only delay the inevitable. She could try to run, but where could she go with no money and no connections beyond these mountains? "The charges are complicated," she said finally. and largely based on misunderstandings about my family's financial situation. Misunderstandings that involve several $1,000s, according to this telegram. Benjamin stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Sheriff, with all due respect, Miss Chambers is a guest in my home. If there are legal matters to be resolved, perhaps they should be handled through proper channels rather than intimidation." "Now, Ben, nobody's trying to intimidate anyone. But I do have a legal obligation to investigate when I receive official communications about potential criminal activity. And what exactly are you investigating? A woman who traveled west to honor her family's commitments? Someone who's been nothing but helpful and respectful since she arrived?" Evelyn stared at Benjamin in surprise. She hadn't expected him to defend her, especially not when he barely knew her and had his own reputation to consider in the community. Sheriff Morrison closed his notebook and stood. "I'm not saying anyone's done anything wrong, Ben, but I do need to telegraph Boston and let them know what I've found here. And Miss Chambers, I'm afraid I have to ask you not to leave the area until this matter is resolved." "How long might that take?" Evelyn asked. "Could be a few days, could be a few weeks. Depends on how quickly the folks back east want to pursue things." After the sheriff and his deputies left, Evelyn and Benjamin sat in silence while the morning light slanted through the kitchen windows. The distant sound of cattle lowing in the meadow and the creek running over stones seemed unnaturally loud after the tension of the official visit. "You didn't have to defend me," Evelyn said finally, "didn't I?" Benjamin was looking out the window toward the mountains, his profile serious and thoughtful. "Seems to me that a man has a responsibility to protect guests in his home, regardless of the circumstances that brought them there. Even guests who might be wanted for fraud." Benjamin turned to meet her eyes. "Are you?" "It's complicated. Most important things are." He stood and moved to the stove, refilling both their coffee cups with careful precision. "Want to tell me the real story?" Evelyn considered her options and realized she had very few left. "My father died last winter and left me with debts I couldn't pay. I've been trying to keep at our house, but the creditors finally lost patience. When Catherine responded to your advertisement, I saw it as a way to earn enough money to settle what I owed and start fresh somewhere else. And Catherine's elopement complicated that plan. Catherine's elopement destroyed that plan. I came west, hoping to honor her commitment and earn the money she would have received. But I realize now how naive that was." Benjamin sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "What kind of debts are we talking about?" "Medical school loans, mostly. My father trained to be a physician, but he never quite got ahead of the costs. When he died, they became my responsibility." "And the fraud charges?" Evelyn hesitated, then decided that complete honesty was her only remaining option. "I may have allowed people to believe I was Catherine for longer than was strictly truthful, and I may have used her identity to secure passage west." "May have?" "Did. I did those things." Benjamin nodded slowly, as if her confession had confirmed something he'd already suspected. "And now you're trapped here until the law decides what to do with you. It appears so." Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the mountain peaks, the kind of late spring weather that could turn dangerous quickly in the high country. Benjamin watched the approaching front with the practiced eye of a man who'd learned to read the mountain's moods. "Looks like we're going to get some weather," he said. "Bad weather, the kind that makes traveling dangerous even under the best circumstances." Evelyn followed his gaze and saw the dark wall of clouds rolling toward them. "How long do mountain storms usually last?" "This time of year? Could be a few hours, could be a few days. Hard to tell." Benjamin set down his coffee cup and moved toward the door. "I'd better secure the animals and make sure we have enough firewood brought in. Might be a while before anyone can travel these roads safely." As he reached for his coat, he paused and looked back at her. "Miss Chambers, I want you to know that regardless of what the sheriff's investigation turns up, you're welcome to stay here until this storm passes and you can figure out your next step. A man doesn't turn a woman out into weather like this, no matter what she might have done." Evelyn felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest at his words. She'd spent so many years fighting the world alone that she'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone willing to stand between her and the storm. "Thank you," she said simply. "That's very kind." Benjamin shrugged, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "It's just basic decency. Besides," he added with the hint of a smile, "you make better coffee than I do. Be ashamed to lose that before the weather clears." As he headed out to prepare for the storm, Evelyn remained at the kitchen table, listening to the wind beginning to howl through the mountain passes. She was trapped now, by the law and by the weather, and by circumstances she could never have anticipated. But for the first time since leaving Boston, she didn't feel entirely alone. The storm raged for 3 days, trapping Evelyn and Benjamin in the cabin with nothing but each other's company, and the growing awareness that their carefully maintained distance was becoming harder to sustain. On the second morning, when Benjamin went to check on the horses, he found his prize mare, Duchess, lying in her stall with a deep gash across her hindquarters. "Looks like she caught herself on something sharp during the storm," he said, leading the injured animal out of the barn. "Probably a piece of loose roofing that came down in the wind." Evelyn followed him outside, pulling her shawl tight against the cold morning air. The wound was ugly, bleeding freely, and already showing signs of infection around the edges. She watched Benjamin examine it with gentle hands, his face grim with concern. "She needs cleaning and stitching," Evelyn said, quietly. "I know. I'll ride down to Doc Henderson in town once the road's clear enough." That could be days, and by then Evelyn stopped herself, realizing she was about to overstep the careful boundaries they'd established. Benjamin looked up at her, his eyes sharp with sudden interest. By then what? By then the infection could spread. She could lose the leg, or worse. "You sound like you know something about this." Evelyn hesitated, then made a decision that would change everything between them. "I do. Wait here." She hurried back to the cabin and retrieved her father's medical kit from beneath her bed, the worn leather bag that contained the tools of a trade she'd never been allowed to practice openly. When she returned to the barn, Benjamin was still kneeling beside Duchess, stroking her neck to keep her calm. "My father was a physician," Evelyn said, setting the bag down and opening it to reveal surgical instruments, bottles of carbolic acid, and carefully wound silk sutures. "He taught me to assist him when I was young, before he realized that society would never accept a woman doctor." Benjamin stared at the professional array of medical supplies, then at Evelyn's steady hands as she prepared the instruments. "You know how to use these things? I've stitched wounds, set bones, and delivered babies. Not officially, of course. But my father believed that knowledge shouldn't be wasted just because it belonged to the wrong gender." She poured carbolic acid over her hands and the instruments, then knelt beside the mare. "I'll need you to hold her head and keep her as still as possible. This is going to hurt." Benjamin positioned himself at Duchess's head, speaking to her in low, soothing tones while Evelyn worked. She cleaned the wound with practiced efficiency, her movements sure and confident, despite the years that had passed since she'd last performed such a procedure. The mare flinched and trembled, but Benjamin's calming presence kept her steady. "Where did you learn to work with animals?" Evelyn asked as she began placing the first sutures. "Trial and error, mostly. When you live this far from town, you learn to handle most things yourself or lose what you can't fix. It shows. You have good hands with her." Benjamin watched Evelyn work with growing admiration. Her movements were precise and economical, wasting no motion and causing no unnecessary pain. She worked like someone who understood that suffering should be minimized whenever possible, and that healing required both skill and compassion. "Your father taught you well," he said. "He taught me that the body wants to heal itself if you give it the right conditions. Clean the wound, remove the damaged tissue, bring the edges together properly, and nature does the rest." She tied off the last suture and stepped back to examine her work. The wound was closed neatly, the edges aligned perfectly, and already the bleeding had stopped. She'll need to be kept quiet for a few days, and the stitches should come out in about 2 weeks. Benjamin ran his hand along Duchess's neck, feeling the tension leave her muscles as the pain subsided. "I don't know how to thank you. She was Martha's favorite. I couldn't have stood to lose her." Something in his voice made Evelyn look at him more closely. "She's special to you. Martha always said Duchess understood her moods better than I did. When Martha was sick at the end, Duchess would stand at the fence closest to the house, just watching, like she knew." Benjamin's voice grew quiet. "After the funeral, I found her standing in the same spot every morning for weeks, waiting." Evelyn felt her heart clench at the image of the faithful mare, keeping vigil for her lost mistress. Animals grieve too. People don't always realize that. Do they heal? From grief, I mean? The question hung between them, heavy with implications that went far beyond veterinary medicine. Evelyn packed her instruments away carefully, considering her answer. "I think they learn to carry it differently. The grief doesn't disappear, but it becomes part of them instead of something that controls them. They find ways to live around it." Benjamin nodded slowly, understanding that she was talking about more than horses. "Is that what you've done? Learned to live around it?" "I've learned to live around a lot of things. Disappointment, loneliness, the knowledge that the world will never let me be what I was trained to be." Evelyn closed the medical bag and stood. "Survival is a skill like any other. You practice it until it becomes second nature." They walked back to the cabin in companionable silence, the crisis with Duchess having shifted something fundamental in their relationship. Benjamin had seen her competence and intelligence in action, while Evelyn had been allowed to use skills that gave her life meaning beyond mere survival. Over the next few days, as the storm gradually blew itself out and the roads began to clear, they fell into new routines that acknowledged their changing dynamic. Benjamin found excuses to ask for her help with various tasks around the homestead, while Evelyn began offering suggestions for improvements with the confidence of someone whose opinions were valued. She reorganized his sparse pantry with an efficiency that impressed him, grouping supplies logically and creating an inventory system that would prevent waste. She mended his shirts with neat, precise stitches that were far superior to his own rough attempts at sewing. Most surprisingly, she took over the household accounts after discovering that Benjamin's record-keeping consisted mainly of scratches on a piece of bark. "You're losing money on your cattle sales," she told him one evening as they sat by the fire, the account books spread across the kitchen table between them. "The middleman in Cedar Falls is taking too large a percentage." "Maybe, but he's the only buyer, willing to make the trip up here for small herds. What if you banded together with the other ranchers, pool your cattle and drive them to Denver yourselves? You'd get better prices and cut out the middleman entirely." Benjamin looked up from the harness he was mending, surprised by the suggestion. That would require organizing the other ranchers, getting them to work together instead of competing. "You have influence in the community. People respect you." "Some people. Others think I'm just a hermit who's been alone too long to be good company." Evelyn set down her pen and studied his face in the lamplight. "Is that what you think you are?" "I don't know what I am anymore. I used to think I was a husband, a man building something permanent with his wife. Then I thought I was a widower, keeping alive the memory of what we'd built together. Now," he gestured helplessly around the cabin, "now I'm not sure of anything. Now you're a man who saved my life by letting me stay, when you had every reason to send me away. A man who knows how to gentle a frightened horse and grow things in impossible soil. A man who sees potential solutions instead of just problems." Benjamin met her eyes across the table, seeing something there that made his chest tighten with unfamiliar emotion. "When did you become so wise about other people's lives?" "When I realized that understanding others was easier than understanding myself." Outside, the wind had finally died down, leaving behind the profound silence that only existed in wild places, far from civilization. Inside the cabin, two people who had been strangers a week ago sat in the warm glow of lamplight. discovering that sometimes the most important conversations happened when you weren't trying to have them at all. The leather-bound books had been tucked away in a wooden crate beneath Benjamin's bed, forgotten relics from a life he'd lived before grief simplified his world down to basic survival. Evelyn discovered them by accident while helping him search for extra blankets during a particularly cold night, and the way her face lit up when she saw the familiar spines made Benjamin realize how much she'd been missing, the intellectual stimulation that had shaped her life in Boston. "Milton," she whispered, running her fingers along the worn spine of Paradise Lost. "And Shakespeare, Dickens, even some Emerson. I haven't seen a proper library in months." Benjamin felt an unexpected flush of embarrassment. Martha loved to read. "I bought them for her, mostly, though I tried to keep up with some of it." "Tried to keep up? My schooling ended early, had to work the family farm after my father died. Never got much past basic reading and writing." Evelyn pulled out a volume of Tennyson and opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the familiar verses with the hunger of someone who'd been starved for intellectual nourishment. "Would you like me to read to you? In the evenings, I mean. It might make the long nights pass more pleasantly." Benjamin hesitated, feeling the old shame that came with admitting his limitations. "I'm not sure I'd understand most of it. Understanding comes with practice. Besides, some of these stories are meant to be heard rather than read silently. They were written for voices." That evening, as the wind howled through the mountain passes and snow continued to pile against the windows, Evelyn settled into Martha's rocking chair with a volume of Dickens while Benjamin worked on repairing a bridle at the kitchen table. Her voice was clear and expressive as she began reading A Christmas Carol, bringing Scrooge and his ghosts to life in the warm circle of lamplight. Benjamin found himself setting aside his work to listen, drawn in despite himself by the rhythm of her words and the vivid pictures they painted. He'd never experienced stories this way before, as living things that could transport him beyond the walls of his cabin to streets he'd never walked and lives he'd never imagined. "You read beautifully," he said when she paused at the end of a chapter. "Thank you. My father used to say that reading aloud was a lost art, that people had forgotten how powerful the human voice could be when it was properly trained. Is that something else he taught you?" "Among other things. He believed that education should be broad rather than narrow, that understanding literature was as important as understanding anatomy." Evelyn closed the book and looked at him thoughtfully. "Would you like me to help you with your reading? Not because you need help, but because sharing books might make them more enjoyable for both of us." Benjamin considered the offer, weighing his pride against the genuine desire he felt to understand the worlds contained in those leather volumes. "What did you have in mind?" "What we could read together, take turns with passages, discuss what we've read. I could help with any words or concepts that seem unclear. And you wouldn't think less of me for needing that kind of help?" Evelyn leaned forward in the rocking chair, her expression serious. "Benjamin, you've built this homestead with your own hands. You understand animals and weather and growing things in ways that no book could teach. You have practical wisdom that most educated men would envy. The fact that you didn't have the same formal schooling doesn't diminish that." Something loosened in Benjamin's chest at her words. A knot of shame he'd carried for so long he'd forgotten it was there. "All right then, but I want to contribute something in return." "What do you mean?" "I mean, if you're going to teach me about books, I should teach you about something I know, something practical that might be useful to you." Evelyn smiled, intrigued by the idea. "What did you have in mind? How about horses? You handled Duchess well when she was injured, but there's more to working with them than just medical care. If you're going to be living in this country, you should know how to ride properly, how to read their moods, how to communicate with them." "I'd like that. Though I should warn you, my experience with horses has been limited to the occasional carriage ride in Boston. Then we'll start with the basics." Over the following days, they established new routines that brought them closer together while maintaining the careful respect that had developed between them. Mornings began with Benjamin teaching Evelyn about the horses, starting with simple grooming and feeding, then progressing to basic riding techniques. She was a quick learner, approaching each lesson with the same methodical intelligence she applied to everything else. Benjamin found himself admiring not just her competence, but the way she listened to his instructions without defensiveness or impatience, treating his knowledge with the same respect she'd shown for her books. "Feel the rhythm of her movement," he said, walking alongside, as Evelyn practiced riding Duchess around the corral. "Don't fight it. Let your body move with hers." "Like this?" Evelyn adjusted her seat in the saddle, and suddenly the awkward bouncing smoothed into a graceful flow. "Exactly like that. You're a natural." "Hardly. But I'm beginning to understand what you mean about communication. She's not just carrying me, we're working together." That's the secret most people never learn. Horses aren't machines to be controlled. They're partners to be understood. In the evenings, their reading sessions became the highlight of both their days. Benjamin's initial hesitation gave way to genuine enthusiasm as Evelyn patiently helped him navigate more complex texts. She never corrected him in ways that felt condescending, instead asking questions that led him to discover meanings for himself. "What do you think Dickens is trying to say about redemption?" she asked one night as they finished another chapter of A Christmas Carol. Benjamin considered the question seriously. That it's never too late to change? That a man can choose to be different than he's always been? That's beautifully put. Do you think that's true in real life as well as in stories? "I hope so," Benjamin said quietly. "I'd hate to think that the mistakes we make or the grief we carry has to define us forever." Evelyn felt her heart skip at the vulnerability in his voice. "I think people are more resilient than they give themselves credit for, more capable of growth and change than they realize. Is that what you're doing here? Growing and changing?" "I'm trying to. I spent so many years in Boston, feeling like I was fighting against the current, never able to be who I really was. Here, for the first time in my adult life, I feel like I might be able to become the person I was meant to be." Benjamin met her eyes across the table, seeing in them the same longing for transformation that he felt stirring in his own chest. "And who is that person?" "I don't know yet, but I'm looking forward to finding out." As she spoke, a log shifted in the fireplace, sending sparks up the chimney and casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls. Outside, the mountain night stretched vast and silent around them, but inside their small circle of warmth and light, two people who had been strangers were slowly discovering that they might become something more. The attraction between them was growing stronger each day, though neither had acknowledged it directly. It showed in the way Benjamin's hand lingered when he helped her down from her horse, in the way Evelyn's voice softened when she read passages about love and loss, in the comfortable silences that had replaced their initial awkwardness. They were learning each other like a new language, one gesture and conversation at a time, building something that felt both fragile and inevitable. And in the quiet moments before sleep, each wondered what the other was thinking in the room, just across the narrow hallway, and whether this unexpected intimacy could survive the return of the outside world. The sheriff's badge lay in the bottom drawer of Benjamin's desk like a sleeping serpent, wrapped in faded blue cloth and hidden beneath letters he'd never sent and memories he'd tried to forget. Evelyn discovered it while helping him organize his papers, her fingers brushing against the cold metal star as she searched for the deed to his property. "You were a lawman," she said quietly, holding the badge up to catch the afternoon light streaming through the window. Benjamin's jaw tightened as he saw what she'd found. "Was. Past tense. For how long?" 15 years. Started as a deputy in Denver, worked my way up to territorial marshal. Covered everything from cattle rustling to claim jumpers to the occasional bank robbery. Evelyn turned the badge over in her hands, noting the worn edges and the small dent near one of the points. "What made you stop?" Benjamin was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old wounds that had never properly healed. "Martha got sick during a particularly bad winter, consumption. I'd been away for 3 weeks chasing a gang of horse thieves into the mountains, and when I came home, she was already burning with fever. Doc Henderson said if I'd been there earlier, if she'd gotten treatment sooner. He stopped, his hands clenching into fists. I chose my duty over my wife, and it killed her. Benjamin, that's not. It is, though. I knew she'd been feeling poorly before I left, but the job always came first. Always. Until the day I realized that all the criminals I'd caught and all the laws I'd enforced didn't matter a damn if I lost the only person who made my life worth living. Evelyn set the badge down carefully on the desk between them. So you came here, to the mountains. I came here to disappear, to build something small and manageable that I couldn't fail at through pride or ambition or misplaced priorities. And now, Benjamin looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Now, I'm not sure what I'm building anymore. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching riders. Through the window, they could see 3 men on horseback coming up the trail at a fast clip, their movements urgent and purposeful. Benjamin recognized them immediately, his nearest neighbors, the Morrison brothers, who ran cattle on the next ridge over. "Trouble," he said, reaching for his gun belt out of old habit. Tom Morrison was off his horse before it had come to a complete stop, his face grim with worry and exhaustion. "Ben, thank God. You're here. We need your help." "What's happened?" "Rustlers hit our herd last night, took 40 head and killed 2 of our hands when they tried to stop them. Sheriff Morrison's put together a posse, but we need every experienced man we can get," Benjamin felt. The familiar tightening in his chest that came with the call to duty. How many men in the gang? At least 6, maybe more. They're well organized and well armed. This isn't some group of amateurs looking for easy money. Any idea which direction they headed? North, toward the high passes. They're probably planning to drive the cattle across the territorial line and sell them in Colorado. Benjamin nodded, his mind already shifting into the tactical thinking that had served him well during his years as a marshal. "Give me 10 minutes to saddle up and gather my gear." As the Morrison brothers waited outside, Benjamin moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, collecting his rifle, ammunition, and the supplies he'd need for what could be several days in the mountains. Evelyn watched him transform before her eyes from the quiet, contemplative man she'd come to know into something harder and more dangerous. "How long will you be gone?" she asked. "However long it takes. Could be a few days, could be a week or more if they give us a hard chase. And if something happens to you?" Benjamin paused in his preparations, struck by the genuine fear in her voice. "Nothing's going to happen to me. I've been tracking men through these mountains longer than most of these rustlers have been alive." "That's not what I meant." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw something in her eyes that made his chest tight with emotions he wasn't ready to name. "Evelyn, I know we haven't talked about what this is between us, or where it might lead, but I need you to know that the thought of losing you terrifies me in ways I don't fully understand." Benjamin crossed the room in 3 quick strides and took her face in his hands, his calloused thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones. "I don't want to leave you, not now, when we're just beginning to, then don't go. I have to. These men killed innocent people, and they'll keep killing until someone stops them. I have skills that could help bring them to justice." "And what about your skills here? What about the life you're building, the man you're becoming?" "This is part of who I am, Evelyn. The part that couldn't save Martha, but might be able to save someone else." She saw then that this wasn't really about the rustlers, or even about justice. This was about Benjamin's need to prove to himself that his years as a lawman had meant something, that the skills he'd learned and the sacrifices he'd made could still serve a purpose beyond his own guilt and regret. "Then I'm coming with you," she said. "Absolutely not. This is dangerous work, and you'll need someone with medical skills if there's fighting. You said yourself that 2 men are already dead. How many more will die if there's no one there to treat the wounded?" Benjamin stared at her, torn between admiration for her courage and fear for her safety. Evelyn, these aren't the kind of men who show mercy to women. If we're caught, then we won't be caught. You know these mountains better than anyone, and I know how to stay quiet and follow orders. We'll be more useful together than apart. Outside, Tom Morrison called impatiently for Benjamin to hurry. Time was running out, and every minute they delayed gave the rustlers a bigger lead. Benjamin made his decision with the swift certainty that had served him well in his law enforcement days. Stay close to me at all times. Do exactly what I tell you, when I tell you. And if I say run, you run without looking back or asking questions. Agreed. And Evelyn, when this is over, we're going to have a long talk about what's happening between us. I'd like that. Benjamin kissed her then, hard and quick, tasting desperation and promise in equal measure. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard, and the air between them crackled with unspoken possibilities. Let's go catch some criminals, Evelyn said, reaching for her coat, with hands that were steadier than she felt. As they rode out with the posse into the gathering dusk, Benjamin couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change once again. But this time, instead of running from his past, he was riding toward a future that might finally allow him to be both the man he'd been and the man he was becoming. The pressed flower lay between the pages of Benjamin's Bible, like a prayer made tangible, its delicate purple petals still holding the faint ghost of color after 3 years of darkness. Evelyn found it while they made camp on the second night of tracking the rustlers, the small leather-bound book tumbling from Benjamin's saddlebags when he reached for his bedroll. Larkspur, she said softly, recognizing the bloom despite its faded state. Martha's favorite? Benjamin's hand stilled on his blankets, and for a moment the only sounds were the crackling of their small fire and the distant howling of wolves in the high country. She planted them around the cabin our first spring together, said they reminded her of the sky on a perfect day. Evelyn held the Bible carefully, feeling the weight of the grief and love pressed between its pages. She must have been very beautiful. She was, but more than that, she was. Benjamin struggled to find words that could capture the essence of a woman who had been gone longer than she'd been his wife. She was peace. When I came home from weeks on the trail, covered in dust and carrying too much darkness, she could make it all disappear just by smiling. And you feel guilty for finding happiness again. It wasn't a question, and Benjamin didn't try to deny it. They'd been riding together for 2 days, sharing the quiet intimacy that came from watching each other's backs in dangerous country, and pretense had become impossible between them. I used to talk to her, he admitted. In the evenings, when the loneliness got too heavy to carry alone, I'd tell her about my day, about the decisions I was making, about how empty the cabin felt without her laughter. And I always felt like she was listening. And now? Now, I find myself wanting to talk to you instead, wanting to share things with you that I used to save for her memory. Benjamin looked across the fire at Evelyn, his face shadowed by conflicting emotions. It feels like betrayal. Evelyn closed the Bible gently and handed it back to him. What if it's not betrayal? What if it's Martha's final gift to you? What do you mean? I mean, what if she loved you so much that she wouldn't want you to spend the rest of your life mourning? What if finding someone else to care about is exactly what she hoped would happen? Benjamin stared into the flames, wrestling with thoughts he'd been avoiding for months. I kissed you yesterday. You did. And it felt right. Evelyn finished quietly. It felt right, different from what you had with Martha, but right in its own way. How can you be so certain? Evelyn pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them as she considered her answer. Because I've spent my entire adult life believing that I was too old, too educated, too set in my ways to inspire real affection in any man. And then I met you, and for the first time in my life, I felt like someone saw who I really was and found it worth caring about. Evelyn, I'm not trying to replace Martha's memory. Benjamin, I couldn't even if I wanted to. But maybe there's room in your heart for something new, alongside something treasured. Before Benjamin could respond, the sound of voices drifting on the night wind made them both freeze. He gestured for silence and moved to the edge of their camp, crouching low to listen. After several minutes, he returned with his face grim. "The rustlers are camped about a quarter-mile south of here. Sounds like they're arguing about something. How many? At least 6 voices, maybe 7, and they've got sentries posted, which means they know they're being followed." Evelyn felt her pulse quicken with a mixture of fear and anticipation. "What do we do?" "We wait until the rest of the posse catches up, then coordinate an attack at first light. And if they move before then?" Benjamin checked his rifle and pistol, his movements automatic and practiced. "Then we follow at a distance and hope they lead us somewhere we can take them without too much risk to the cattle or ourselves." They settled into their bedrolls on opposite sides of the dying fire. But sleep proved elusive. Every sound in the darkness could be a rustler moving through the trees. Every shadow could hide a threat. Evelyn found herself listening to Benjamin's breathing across the small space between them, taking comfort in the steady rhythm that told her he was still alive and alert. "Benjamin," she whispered into the darkness, "when this is over, when we go back to the homestead, what happens then?" "What do you want to happen?" "I want to stay. I want to help you build something lasting and good. I want to read books with you in the evenings and tend your animals when they're hurt and wake up every morning knowing that I'm exactly where I belong." Benjamin was quiet for so long that she thought he might have fallen asleep. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I want that too. But I need you to understand what you'd be choosing. Life in these mountains is hard and lonely and sometimes dangerous. The winters are brutal, the nearest neighbor is miles away, and there are no guarantees that any of us will live to see another spring. Do you think I don't know that? Do you think I haven't watched you split firewood in a blizzard and mend fences in weather that would kill weaker men? I've seen what this life demands, and I'm not afraid of it. And what about your past? The charges against you, the debts in Boston? I'll face whatever I have to face, but I want to face it with you beside me, if you'll have me." Benjamin rose from his bedroll and crossed to where she lay, kneeling beside her in the starlight. He traced the line of her face with gentle fingers, memorizing the feel of her skin and the way she looked at him with complete trust, despite the dangers surrounding them. "Evelyn Chambers, when we get back to Cedar Falls, I'm going to marry you properly, with a minister and witnesses and all the legal protections that can keep you safe from whatever's chasing you." "Is that a proposal or a promise?" "It's both." She reached up and pulled his face down to hers, kissing him with all the pent-up longing and hope that had been building between them for weeks. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and the night air felt charged with possibility. "Then I accept," she whispered against his lips. "Both the proposal and the promise." Benjamin held her close, feeling the last of his resistance to love crumble away like an old wall, finally surrendering to time and weather. Martha would always be part of him, preserved in memory like the flower in his Bible. But Evelyn was his future, bright and challenging and full of surprises he was only beginning to discover. In the distance, an owl called through the darkness, and Benjamin took it as a good omen. Tomorrow they would face whatever dangers waited with the dawn, but tonight, for the first time in 3 years, he fell asleep holding someone he loved, and his dreams were filled with hope instead of regret. The wanted poster arrived with the morning light, carried by a federal marshal whose presence in their camp sent ice through Evelyn's veins. She recognized her own face staring back at her from the crude drawing, even though the artist had made her look harder and more calculating than she'd ever appeared in any mirror. "Wanted for embezzlement," the poster proclaimed in bold letters. "Evelyn Chambers, also known as Catherine Whitfield, $500 reward." Marshal James Crawford was a lean man in his 50s, with the patience of someone who'd spent years tracking criminals across impossible distances. He studied Evelyn with the cool assessment of a professional, comparing her face to the drawing in his hand while the rest of the posse gathered around their camp in tense silence. "Miss Evelyn Chambers," he said, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority, "I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of embezzling funds from the Chambers medical practice in Boston, Massachusetts." Benjamin stepped between them, his hand resting on his gun butt with casual familiarity. "Marshal, we're in the middle of tracking cattle rustlers who've killed 2 innocent men. Perhaps this could wait until—" "I'm afraid it can't wait, Ben. I've been tracking Miss Chambers for 3 weeks, and I have orders to bring her back to Boston to face charges immediately." Evelyn felt the weight of every eye in the camp upon her, some sympathetic, others calculating the value of the reward money. Sheriff Morrison looked torn between his duty as a lawman and his respect for Benjamin, while the Morrison brothers whispered among themselves with obvious interest. "There's more to this story than what's on that poster," Benjamin said firmly. "I'm sure there is, but my job isn't to determine guilt or innocence. It's to transport accused criminals back to face trial." Evelyn stepped forward, her spine straight and her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. "Marshal Crawford, before you arrest me, I think you should know the full truth about those charges. Miss Chambers, anything you say can be used against you in a court of law. I understand. But these men deserve to know what kind of person they've been riding with." She looked around the circle of faces, settling finally on Benjamin's. "The money that was taken from my father's medical practice wasn't stolen by me. It was taken by my brother, Dr. Thomas Chambers, to pay gambling debts he'd accumulated over several years." Marshal Crawford frowned, consulting a file of papers from his saddlebags. "According to my information, Thomas Chambers died of consumption 6 months before the embezzlement was discovered." "That's correct. He died knowing what he'd done, but unable to make it right. When the bank auditors discovered the missing funds, they assumed I was responsible because I'd been helping manage the practice's books after my father's death." "And why didn't you simply explain your brother's involvement?" Evelyn's voice grew quiet, heavy with the weight of a sacrifice that had cost her everything. "Because Thomas left behind a wife and 2 small children. If the truth came out, Sarah would have lost her home, her reputation, and any chance of supporting herself and the children. Society doesn't forgive the widow of a thief, even when she had no knowledge of his crimes." Benjamin stared at her, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "So you let them think you were guilty?" "I confessed to the embezzlement and agreed to make full restitution in exchange for the promise that no charges would be filed against Thomas's estate. I thought I could earn enough money to pay back what was owed and start fresh somewhere else." "But something went wrong," Marshal Crawford said, his professional interest clearly piqued despite himself. "The creditors got impatient. They wanted immediate payment instead of the installment plan we'd agreed upon. When I couldn't produce the full amount, they decided to pursue criminal charges after all." Tom Morrison spat into the fire, his expression disgusted. "So you're telling us you're innocent of the crime you confessed to?" "I'm telling you that I chose to protect my brother's family instead of protecting myself. Whether that makes me guilty or innocent is a matter of perspective." "The law doesn't deal in perspective," Marshal Crawford said, though his tone had softened slightly. "It deals in evidence and testimony." "Then you should know that I have a letter from my sister-in-law that explains everything," Evelyn said. "She's finally agreed to tell the truth about her husband's gambling and the missing money. The letter is in my belongings back at Mr. Dalworth's homestead." Benjamin felt a surge of hope. A letter that could clear her name? A letter that could complicate matters considerably, the marshal corrected. But it would need to be verified and presented through proper legal channels. Sheriff Morrison had been quiet through most of the exchange, but now he stepped forward with the authority of local law enforcement. "Marshal Crawford, I've had Miss Chambers under observation for the past 2 weeks. She's shown nothing but good character and Christian behavior. If she says she has evidence that could clear her name, don't you think she deserves the chance to present it? What I think doesn't matter. I have a federal warrant and orders to bring her back to Boston." "And what about the rustlers?" Benjamin asked. "2 men are dead, and the criminals are getting further away every minute we stand here arguing." Marshal Crawford looked around the circle of determined faces and seemed to weigh his options. "The rustlers are also my concern. I've been tracking them as well as Miss Chambers. They're wanted for crimes in 3 territories. "Then let's catch them first," Benjamin said. "Let Miss Chambers help us track them down, and then we'll all ride back to Cedar Falls together to sort out this legal business properly." "Absolutely not. I can't allow a federal fugitive to participate in a law enforcement operation, even if that fugitive has medical skills that could save lives when we catch up to these killers." Evelyn saw her chance and took it. "Marshal, 2 of your men are already dead. If there's fighting when you catch the rustlers, you'll need someone who can treat bullet wounds and stop bleeding." "I have medical training and supplies. I can help." The marshal studied her for a long moment, clearly torn between his duty and the practical realities of their situation. "If I agree to this, and I'm not saying I will, you would be under guard at all times. Any attempt to escape would result in immediate arrest and transport back to Boston without further consideration of your evidence." "I understand." "And if we recover the evidence you mentioned, you'll submit to arrest and trial without resistance? If the evidence doesn't clear my name?" "Yes." Benjamin felt admiration for her courage, mixed with fear for her safety. She was gambling everything on a letter that might or might not be enough to prove her innocence, all while agreeing to ride into danger alongside men who still considered her a wanted criminal. "All right," Marshal Crawford said finally, "but I want it understood that this is highly irregular, and if anything goes wrong, the responsibility is mine alone." "Understood," Benjamin said. "Now can we get moving? Every minute we waste here gives those rustlers more time to disappear into the high country." As the posse prepared to ride out, Benjamin pulled Evelyn aside for a private word. "Are you certain about this letter? About what it can prove?" "I'm certain that Sarah finally found the courage to tell the truth about what Thomas did. Whether that's enough to satisfy the federal courts," she shrugged, "I suppose we'll find out. And if it's not enough?" Evelyn reached up and touched his face gently, memorizing the feel of his skin and the concern in his eyes. "Then at least I'll have had these few weeks with you. At least I'll have known what it felt like to be loved for who I really am, instead of who society wanted me to be." Benjamin caught her hand and pressed it to his lips. "It's going to be enough. It has to be." As they mounted their horses and rode toward whatever waited in the mountains ahead, both wondered if love could survive the weight of federal law and the dangerous men they were chasing. But for now, it was enough to ride side by side toward an uncertain future, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. The telegraph key sat silent on the desk of the Cedar Falls Western Union office, a brass and steel instrument that held the power to change everything. Word had arrived through the mountain telegraph lines that Sarah Chambers had finally found the courage to send the testimony that could clear Evelyn's name. But the message was fragmented, interrupted by spring storms that had damaged the lines between Colorado and Massachusetts, leaving everyone uncertain about its complete contents. Partial message received. The telegraph operator explained to the assembled group crowded into his small office, something about gambling debts and new evidence, but the connection keeps cutting out. "Could be hours or days before we get the full transmission." Marshal Crawford studied the incomplete message with professional frustration. What exactly did come through? Thomas Chambers' confession letter, stop gambling debts, church records, stop Sarah Chambers' testimony sworn, before magistrate stop, charges should be dropped, stop, more details to follow, stop. Benjamin felt hope surge through his chest, but Evelyn's expression remained cautious. "It's not enough," she said quietly. "Not without the full details and proper documentation." "It's a start," Sheriff Morrison said. "Enough to delay any federal transport until we get the complete message." Marshal Crawford nodded reluctantly. "I suppose I can wait for the full transmission, but Miss Chambers remains in custody until this matter is resolved." The custody arrangement had become the central point of tension, dividing the small mountain community. Benjamin had posted bail and taken responsibility for Evelyn's whereabouts, but several townspeople had expressed their displeasure with the arrangement. The promise of a $500 reward had awakened the greed in men who'd never seen that much money at one time, while others genuinely believed that harboring a wanted criminal was wrong, regardless of the circumstances. Old Pete Morrison cornered Benjamin outside the telegraph office as the crowd dispersed. "Ben, I've known you for 10 years, and I respect what you're trying to do, but some folks are getting mighty worked up about this situation." "What kind of worked up?" "The kind that involves late-night meetings at the saloon and talk about taking matters into their own hands. There's men in this town who think $500 is worth more than your word, and they're getting impatient waiting for the federal government to sort things out." Benjamin felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with the recognition of approaching danger. "Any idea who's leading this talk?" "Jake Wheeler's been buying drinks and asking pointed questions. You know how he gets when he smells money." Benjamin knew Wheeler well enough to be concerned. The man owned the largest general store in Cedar Falls and had a reputation for putting profit above principle in most of his dealings. More troubling, he had enough influence with the newer residents to cause real problems. How many men is he talking to? Hard to say. Maybe 6 or 8 who might actually act on his suggestions. But that's enough to cause trouble if they decide to force the issue. Benjamin thanked Pete for the warning and headed back to the boarding house where Evelyn was staying under guard. He found her in the small sitting room, reading one of the books they'd shared at the homestead, while Deputy Miller dozed in a chair by the door. "We need to talk," Benjamin said quietly. Evelyn looked up from her reading, immediately recognizing the tension in his voice. "What's happened?" "Some of the locals are getting restless about the reward money. There's talk about taking you into custody themselves and turning you over to the marshal, whether the telegraph message exonerates you or not." "I see." Evelyn closed the book and set it aside with steady hands, though Benjamin could see the fear in her eyes. "What do you suggest we do?" "I suggest we don't wait around to find out how serious they are. I have friends in Denver who could help us get a fair hearing on this matter. And my old contacts in the Territorial Marshal Service could ensure your safety while the legal questions get sorted out." "You're talking about running away. I'm talking about strategic withdrawal to a more secure position." Evelyn considered this for a moment, then shook her head. "If I run now, I'll be running for the rest of my life. The charges will follow me wherever I go, and I'll never be free to build the life I want with you. And if you stay, you might not live long enough to see those charges resolved. Then we need to resolve them quickly." Benjamin knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "Evelyn, I can't protect you if half the town decides they want that reward money. I'm good, but I'm not good enough to fight off 8 men at once. Then, we need to make sure it doesn't come to a fight." "How?" "By getting ahead of this situation instead of reacting to it. If Jake Wheeler is stirring up trouble for money, we need to give the community a better reason to support us than greed." Benjamin studied her face, seeing the same determined intelligence that had impressed him from their first meeting. "What did you have in mind?" "A public hearing. Tomorrow morning in the church. We invite everyone in town to hear the evidence as it comes in over the telegraph. We let them see the truth for themselves, instead of letting Wheeler control the narrative with whispers and promises of reward money. That's risky. If the evidence doesn't come through clearly, or if it's not as exonerating as we hope, then at least we'll have faced this honestly, instead of skulking around like criminals." Benjamin admired her courage, even as it terrified him. "And if Wheeler and his friends decide to take action before the hearing, then you'll do what you've always done, protect the innocent and uphold the law." Deputy Miller stirred in his chair, awakened by their conversation. "Sorry, folks. Didn't mean to eavesdrop. But if you're planning some kind of public hearing, the marshal's going to want to know about it." "Of course," Evelyn said. "This needs to be done properly, with official oversight." Benjamin stood and began pacing the small room, his mind working through the tactical challenges of their situation. "We'll need the church because it's the only building large enough to hold the whole community. We'll need the preacher's blessing to use it, and we'll need to make sure the hearing is conducted fairly." "What about security?" Deputy Miller asked. "If there's going to be a crowd and tensions are running high, I'll handle security," Benjamin said. "I know who we can trust and who we can't." As they made their plans, the telegraph key in the Western Union office continued its intermittent chatter, bringing fragments of testimony from Boston that might hold the key to Evelyn's freedom. Each incomplete message raised new questions while answering others, creating a mosaic of evidence that remained frustratingly unclear. Sarah Chambers was indeed ready to testify about her late husband's gambling debts and the pressure he'd felt to steal from the medical practice. Church records showed substantial donations made by Thomas Chambers in the months before his death, money that had clearly come from the stolen funds as his desperate attempt to buy forgiveness. Most significantly, a confession letter had been found among his papers, written just before his death, but never sent, detailing exactly how much he'd taken and why. But the technical details of how this evidence would be presented in federal court remained unclear, and Marshall Crawford was growing increasingly uncomfortable with the irregular nature of their situation. "I've never handled a case quite like this," he admitted to Benjamin as they stood outside the telegraph office in the gathering dusk. "Usually, I arrest people and transport them, and the courts figure out guilt or innocence later. But you've seen enough evidence to have doubts about her guilt. I've seen enough evidence to want the full story before I make any irreversible decisions. Then you'll support the public hearing tomorrow." Marshall Crawford was quiet for a long moment, watching the lights come on in windows around the small town. "I'll allow it, but I want it understood that this is my decision, and I take full responsibility for the consequences." Fair enough. As night fell over Cedar Falls, the various factions in the community prepared for what everyone understood would be a decisive confrontation. Jake Wheeler held court in the saloon, promising his followers that $500 split 8 ways was still enough money to make the risk worthwhile. Sheriff Morrison quietly arranged for additional security, calling in favors from neighboring communities to ensure enough lawmen would be present to maintain order. In her room at the boarding house, Evelyn wrote letters she hoped she'd never have to send one to Sarah Chambers, thanking her for her courage, another to Benjamin expressing her love and asking him to forgive himself if things went wrong. She sealed them carefully and placed them in her carpet bag, alongside the medical instruments that had become symbols of everything she'd sacrificed to protect her family. Benjamin spent the evening checking and rechecking his weapons, planning positions and escape routes with the thorough professionalism that had kept him alive through years of dangerous work. But this time, the stakes felt higher than they ever had before. This time, he wasn't just protecting strangers or upholding abstract principles of justice. This time, he was fighting for the woman he loved and the future they'd only just begun to imagine together. The telegraph key chattered intermittently through the night, bringing fragments of hope and pieces of a puzzle that might finally reveal the truth. But as dawn approached and the time for the public hearing drew near, everyone in Cedar Falls understood that words and evidence might not be enough to prevent violence. Sometimes justice required more than proof. Sometimes it required the courage to stand up and fight for what was right, regardless of the cost. The gold locket lay warm against Evelyn's palm as she stood before the packed church, its weight both comforting and heartbreaking. Inside the delicate oval case were tiny photographs of her brother Thomas's children, little Catherine, age 6, and baby James, barely 2 when their father died. She'd carried it with her from Boston as a reminder of why. She'd sacrificed everything, and now it would serve as the most powerful piece of evidence in her defense. Every pew in the Cedar Falls Community Church was filled, with additional townspeople standing along the walls and crowding near the doorway. The morning sun streamed through the simple windows, illuminating faces that ranged from sympathetic to hostile, curious to calculating. Marshal Crawford sat in the front row beside Sheriff Morrison, while Benjamin positioned himself where he could see both the crowd and the exits. Jake Wheeler had arrived early with his supporters, claiming the best seats and making no effort to hide their intention to challenge whatever evidence might be presented. They whispered among themselves and cast meaningful glances at Evelyn, clearly counting the reward money they expected to claim before the day was over. Reverend Samuel Hayes called the gathering to order with the same gravity he brought to Sunday services. Friends and neighbors, we're here today, not for worship, but for the pursuit of truth. Miss Chambers has requested the opportunity to present evidence regarding the charges against her, and Marshal Crawford has agreed to hear this evidence in public forum. The telegraph operator, nervously clutching a sheaf of papers, stepped forward to read the messages that had arrived throughout the night. His voice shook slightly as he began with the most damning testimony. From Boston, Massachusetts. Sarah Chambers, widow of Dr. Thomas Chambers, sworn statement before Magistrate William Harrison. Quote, "My late husband confessed to me on his deathbed that he had taken money from his father's medical practice to pay gambling debts accumulated over 3 years. The total amount was approximately $4,000. He begged my forgiveness and made me promise to tell the truth after his death, but I was too frightened of the scandal and the loss of our home." Murmurs rippled through the church as people absorbed the implications of this testimony. Jake Wheeler leaned forward in his seat, his expression skeptical. "That's convenient," Wheeler called out. "A deathbed confession from a man who can't speak for himself anymore." Marshal Crawford raised his hand for silence. "Mr. Wheeler, you'll have your chance to speak. For now, let's hear all the evidence." The telegraph operator continued. Quote, "I have found among my husband's papers a letter written just before his death, confessing to the theft and explaining his actions. This letter was meant to be sent to the authorities, but was never mailed due to his sudden decline. I am prepared to present this letter and my testimony to clear Miss Evelyn Chambers of all charges, as she had no knowledge of my husband's crimes and confessed only to protect my children and myself from scandal and destitution." End quote. Evelyn felt her heart leap with hope, but she could see the doubt in many faces around the church. Words on a telegraph were one, proof was another. "What about the letter itself?" Wheeler demanded. "Where's this supposed confession?" "The letter is being sent by special courier and should arrive within the week," the telegraph operator replied. "But there's more testimony." He shuffled through his papers and continued reading. From Father Michael O'Brien, St. Mary's Catholic Church, Boston. Quote, "Dr. Thomas Chambers made substantial donations to our church in the months before his death, totaling nearly $1,000. When I questioned him about these unusually large contributions, he became agitated and spoke of needing to make amends for wrongs he had committed. I now believe these donations represented his attempt to return stolen money through charitable giving." End quote. Benjamin watched the crowd's reaction carefully, noting which faces showed growing sympathy and which remained hostile. The evidence was compelling, but he could see that Wheeler's supporters were preparing to challenge its legitimacy. "That's all very touching," Wheeler said, rising to his feet. "But it's also awfully convenient that all this evidence appears just when Miss Chambers is about to be arrested. How do we know these telegrams are even real? How do we know this isn't all an elaborate fraud designed to help her escape justice?" Several of his supporters voiced their agreement, and Benjamin felt the mood in the church begin to shift towards suspicion and anger. Evelyn stepped forward, her voice clear and steady despite the hostility she faced. "Mr. Wheeler, I understand your skepticism, but I have something here that predates my arrest, something I've carried with me since leaving Boston." She opened the gold locket and held it up so the light caught the tiny photographs inside. "These are my brother's children, Catherine and James Chambers. They are 6 and 2 years old, and they are the reason I confessed to a crime I didn't commit." The church fell silent as she continued. When Thomas died, he left behind a wife who had never worked outside the home and 2 babies who needed food and shelter. The scandal of his gambling and theft would have destroyed them. So I took the blame, hoping to earn enough money to pay back what was stolen and give them a chance at a decent life. "That's a touching story," Wheeler said coldly. "But it's still just a story. Where's the proof?" Before Evelyn could respond, a commotion at the back of the church drew everyone's attention. Deputy Miller was pushing through the crowd, his face grim with urgency. "Marshal Crawford," he called out, "we've got a problem." Jake Wheeler's brother just rode in from the territorial capital with news about Miss Chambers' case. The church fell completely silent as all eyes turned toward the deputy. Benjamin felt his hand drift toward his gun, sensing that whatever news was coming would change everything. Benjamin's wedding ring had sat on his finger for so many years it had worn a permanent groove in his skin, a circle of gold that marked him as Martha's husband even 3 years after her death. But as he watched Jake Wheeler's brother push through the crowd with papers clutched in his fist, Benjamin made a decision that surprised even himself. He worked the ring free and slipped it into his vest pocket, feeling simultaneously guilty and liberated. "Marshal Crawford," Tom Wheeler called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone bearing official news. "I've got documents here from the federal courthouse that change everything." The church fell into tense silence as Tom Wheeler made his way to the front, ignoring his brother Jake's puzzled expression. He handed a sealed envelope to Marshal Crawford, who examined the official seals before breaking them open. "What is it?" Jake Wheeler demanded, clearly expecting vindication for his position. Marshal Crawford's expression grew increasingly serious as he read through the documents. After several minutes, he looked up at the packed church, with the weight of federal authority in his voice. "These are new charges filed against Miss Chambers 3 days ago. Conspiracy to defraud the federal government and interstate transportation of stolen property. The charges carry a mandatory sentence of 5 years in federal prison." Gasps echoed through the church, and Evelyn felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Just when salvation had seemed within reach, her situation had become far worse than before. "That's impossible," Benjamin said, stepping forward. "The money never left Massachusetts. According to these documents, it did. Investigators claim that Miss Chambers used stolen funds to purchase a train ticket across state lines, making it a federal crime." Marshal Crawford's voice carried apology as well as authority. "I'm sorry, Miss Chambers, but these charges supersede any local considerations about your innocence or guilt in the original embezzlement." Jake Wheeler's face split into a triumphant grin. "Looks like that reward money just got a lot more certain." But his brother Tom wasn't smiling. "Jake, you need to see the rest of this." Tom Wheeler pulled another document from his coat and handed it to Marshal Crawford, who read it quickly before his eyebrows rose in surprise. "Well, this is interesting. It seems there's also a federal warrant for the arrest of Jacob Wheeler on charges of bribing federal investigators and interfering with official correspondence." Jake Wheeler's face went white. "That's ridiculous. I never. According to this document, you paid a telegraph operator in Denver to alter messages coming from Boston and to file false reports about Miss Chambers' activities." The operator confessed when federal agents caught him trying to flee the territory. The church erupted in angry murmurs as people realized they'd been manipulated. Jake Wheeler looked around desperately, seeing his support evaporate as his own crimes came to light. You can't prove any of this," he blustered. "It's my word against some corrupt telegraph operator." "Actually," Tom Wheeler said quietly, "it's not just his word. I've been working with federal investigators for weeks, Jake. They know about all of it, the bribery, the false messages, even your plan to split the reward money with cronies here in town." Benjamin felt pieces clicking into place. "The messages we've been receiving, how much of them were real?" Marshal Crawford consulted the documents again. According to this, about half. Sarah Chambers' testimony is genuine, but it was altered to make the evidence seem less conclusive than it actually is. The real confession letter was found weeks ago and has already been accepted by federal prosecutors as proof of Miss Chambers' innocence. Evelyn sank into a nearby pew, overwhelmed by the rapid reversal of her fortunes. "You mean I'm actually cleared of the original charges?" "More than cleared. The federal prosecutors are recommending a full pardon and considering charges against the Boston investigators who pursued the case without properly examining the evidence of your brother's guilt." Jake Wheeler made a break for the door, but Benjamin was ready for him. Years of law enforcement experience served him well, as he intercepted Wheeler near the church exit, bringing him down with a tackle that sent both men crashing into a row of empty chairs. "Let me go!" Wheeler gasped, struggling beneath Benjamin's weight. "I got rights." "You got the right to remain silent," Benjamin replied grimly, hauling Wheeler to his feet. "I'd suggest you use it." As Deputy Miller placed Wheeler under arrest, Benjamin walked back to where Evelyn sat in stunned silence. The church had erupted in excited conversation as people tried to make sense of everything they'd just witnessed. "It's over," he said softly, kneeling beside her pew. "You're free." Evelyn looked at him with tears streaming down her face. "I can hardly believe it. After all these months of running and hiding, believe it," Benjamin said, pulling the wedding ring from his vest pocket. He held it for a moment, thinking of Martha and the love they'd shared, then made his peace with the past and looked toward the future. "Evelyn Chambers," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the chaos around them. "I'd like to ask you something important." She saw the ring in his hands and understood immediately that it wasn't the same one he'd worn for Martha. This was a new ring, simple and clean, representing a new beginning rather than a continuation of the past. "Yes," she said before he could finish asking. "Whatever you're about to ask, the answer is yes." Benjamin slipped the ring onto her finger as the church around them buzzed with celebration and justice finally served. After months of uncertainty and fear, love had triumphed over deception, truth over greed, and hope over despair. The gold locket still hung around Evelyn's neck, but now it represented not just sacrifice, but the knowledge that sometimes protecting the people you love requires incredible courage, and sometimes that courage is rewarded with more happiness than you ever dared to dream possible. The new rocking chair sat beside the original on Benjamin's porch, its fresh pine wood glowing golden in the late afternoon sun. 6 months had passed since the dramatic events in the Cedar Falls church, and Benjamin had spent the long winter evenings carving the matching chair with the same patient care he'd once devoted to his solitude. Now, instead of one chair holding memories of the past, there were 2 chairs facing the future together. Evelyn emerged from the cabin carrying 2 cups of coffee, her movements graceful, despite the slight swell of her belly that announced their coming child. She'd bloomed in the mountain air like one of Martha's neglected roses, finding strength and purpose she'd never known she possessed. The morning sickness had passed, leaving behind a radiant contentment that made Benjamin's heart skip every time he looked at her. "The children should be arriving soon," she said, settling into a chair and placing a protective hand over her stomach. "Are you ready for the invasion?" Benjamin chuckled, adjusting his position to better accommodate the stack of primers and slate boards they'd prepared for the day's lesson. "As ready as any man can be for teaching 8 children to read in a cabin that barely holds 2 adults comfortably." The makeshift school had been Evelyn's idea, born from her observation that most of the mountain children received little formal education beyond what their parents could provide. She'd approached the scattered homestead families during the summer, offering to teach basic reading and arithmetic to any child whose parents could spare them one afternoon a week. The response had been overwhelming, with parents riding miles through dangerous country to give their children opportunities they'd never had themselves. "Mrs. Dolworth," came a young voice from the trail below. Little Mary Peterson was climbing toward the cabin with her characteristic determination, her school slate clutched tightly in one hand and her brother Tommy trailing behind her with obvious reluctance. "Good afternoon, Mary," Evelyn called back. "How are your letters coming along? I can write my whole name now. And Tommy's too, even though he says it's foolish learning." Tommy Peterson scuffed his boots in the dirt and mumbled something under his breath about preferring to learn useful skills like roping and branding. At 12, he was caught between childhood and the harsh realities of mountain life, skeptical of book learning that wouldn't help him handle cattle or survive winter storms. More children appeared on the trail, the Morrison twins with their identical freckled faces, young Sarah Fletcher, who showed remarkable aptitude for arithmetic, and quiet Peter Hayes, whose stutter disappeared entirely when he read aloud. They gathered on the porch with the easy familiarity of students who'd grown to love their weekly lessons despite the long rides to reach the mountain school. Benjamin watched Evelyn transform as the children surrounded her, becoming the teacher her father had always known she could be. She had infinite patience for their questions, creative solutions for their learning difficulties, and the rare gift of making each child feel intelligent and capable, regardless of their starting point. "Today we're going to read from Mr. Dickens," she announced, opening the worn copy of A Christmas Carol that had become their shared text. "Who can remember what happened to Scrooge when we left him last week?" 8 hands shot into the air, and Benjamin marveled at the enthusiasm Evelyn had awakened in children who'd never seen much point in formal education. She'd shown them that stories could transport them beyond the confines of their isolated mountain world, that words had the power to create entire universes in their minds. As the afternoon lesson progressed, Benjamin found himself thinking about legacy and the different ways a person could leave their mark on the world. He'd spent years as a marshal, pursuing justice and protecting the innocent, but these children represented something more lasting than any criminal he'd ever captured. Through Evelyn's teaching, they would carry knowledge and curiosity into their own futures, passing along the gift of education to their own children someday. The lesson ended with the children taking turns reading passages aloud, their voices growing stronger and more confident with each session. When the last student had mounted his horse and headed down the mountain trail, Benjamin and Evelyn sat together in their matching chairs, watching the sunset paint the peaks in shades of rose and gold. "Sarah's letter arrived yesterday," Evelyn said, pulling the correspondence from her apron pocket. "Catherine started school in Boston this fall, and little James is walking now. She says they think of us often and pray for our happiness." "And are we happy?" Benjamin asked, though he already knew the answer from the contentment in her voice and the peace that had settled over his homestead like a blessing. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," Evelyn replied, reaching across the space between their chairs to take his hand. "When I stepped off that train 6 months ago, I thought my life was ending. I never dreamed it was just beginning." Benjamin lifted their joined hands and kissed her knuckles, still amazed by the turn of events that had brought them together. "Sometimes the best things come disguised as disasters. Is that what I was? A disaster?" "You were everything I didn't know I needed," Benjamin said seriously. "A challenge, a companion, a reason to stop hiding from life and start living it again." As full darkness settled over the mountains, they moved their conversation inside to the warmth of the cabin. The evening routine they'd developed, Evelyn reading while Benjamin worked on small projects, had become the foundation of their shared life. Tonight, she chose a passage from Emerson about self-reliance and the courage to trust one's own path, her voice filling the small space with wisdom and beauty. Benjamin paused in his carving, a small cradle that would be ready well before their child's arrival, and looked around the cabin that had once felt like a tomb for his memories. Now it pulsed with life and possibility, filled with the sounds of shared laughter, quiet conversation, and the gentle rhythms of two people building something lasting together. Outside, the mountain wind sang through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled its ancient song to the stars. But inside their circle of lamplight and love, Benjamin and Evelyn had found everything they needed to face whatever the future might bring. They had each other, they had purpose, and they had the profound satisfaction that comes from choosing love over fear, hope over despair, and together over alone. The new rocking chair would weather many seasons beside the old one, holding new memories while honoring those that came before. And in the growing darkness of the mountain night, two people who had found each other against all odds settled into the comfortable silence of those who know they are exactly where they belong.